This dramatization is based on real events, but some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The purpose is educational, showing how seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when dialogue and understanding are abandoned. In the winter of 1985, Chicago stood at a crossroads between its industrial past and an uncertain future. The steel mills that once powered America's heartland were closing, leaving behind empty factories and broken dreams. In the shadows of this decline, organized crime had evolved from the flashy gangsters of prohibition into something more insidious, a quiet network of influence that touched everything from construction contracts to police precincts. This is the story of Frank Kowalski, a mechanic who worked in a small garage on the South Side and whose ordinary life was shattered when his wife Maria disappeared without a trace. What began as a missing person case would evolve into something far more complex, a journey into the hidden structures of power and corruption that defined 1980s Chicago. Through interviews with former detectives, FBI agents, journalists, and neighborhood residents, this investigation pieces together the events of that winter, when one man's search for answers exposed a web of silence that had protected certain interests for decades. It's a story about what happens when official channels fail, when the system itself becomes complicit in its own corruption, and when ordinary people are forced to navigate a world where justice exists only for those who can afford it. The names of some individuals have been changed to protect their identities. This documentary represents our best attempt to understand what happened during those dark months in Chicago and why some truths remain buried even today. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The snow began falling on December 3rd, 1985, coating the south side of Chicago in a deceptive blanket of white that made even the most run-down neighborhoods look peaceful. Frank Kowalski stood in the doorway of his garage on Ashland Avenue, watching the flakes accumulate on the windshield of a '79 Buick he'd been working on for 3 days. The engine had a knock that reminded him of his father's cough before the cancer took him. Persistent, getting worse, impossible to ignore. "Another beautiful day in paradise," he muttered, pulling his cigarette deeper into his lungs. At 34, Frank had the hands of someone who'd been working with engines since he was old enough to hold a wrench. His fingers were permanently stained with motor oil, and he had a scar across his left palm from a fan blade that had caught him when he was 19 and still believed he was invincible. The garage had been his uncle's before lung disease forced him to sell it to Frank for a price that was more gift than transaction. 3 bays, enough work to keep the lights on, and a reputation in the neighborhood for honest prices and repairs that actually lasted. It wasn't the American dream, but it was something solid in a world that seemed to be falling apart, one factory closure at a time. Maria's shift at the diner ended at 6, and she usually stopped by the garage before heading home to their apartment on Racine. She'd bring coffee in a thermos and whatever pie hadn't sold that day, and they'd sit in the office planning their weekend or talking about the vacation they were saving for, maybe Florida in the spring, somewhere warm where they could forget about Chicago winters for a week. By 6:30, Frank was checking his watch. By 7, he was calling the diner. "She left right at 6, Betty, the owner, told him. Said she was going to stop by the garage like always. Took the leftover apple pie. Said you'd been asking about it all week." Frank walked the 6 blocks between the garage and the diner twice, looking for some sign of what might have delayed her. The route took her past Kowalski's corner store, no relation despite the name, where old Stan usually sat by the window watching the neighborhood. Past the bus stop where teenagers gathered to smoke and complain about teachers who didn't understand them. Past the empty lot where the Patel family had been planning to open a grocery store until the permits got tangled up in city bureaucracy. Stan hadn't seen her. The kids at the bus stop barely looked up from their conversation about some girl who'd gotten pregnant and whose father was going to kill her boyfriend. The empty lot remained empty, collecting snow like a grave. At the police station on Halstead, Sergeant Tommy Kerner listened to Frank's story with the weary patience of someone who'd heard variations of it 1,000 times. Missing wife, missing for 3 hours, probably stopped to see a friend, or went shopping without mentioning it. These things usually resolve themselves by morning. "Look, Frank," Kerner said, leaning back in a chair that squeaked like it needed the same kind of attention Frank gave to engines. "Maria's a grown woman. Maybe she decided to see her sister. Maybe she ran into a friend from high school. Give it until tomorrow before you start panicking." "She would have called," Frank insisted. "She always calls if she's going to be late. Always." Kerner had thin grey hair and the soft gut of someone who'd spent too many years behind a desk. He'd known Frank's family for years, had gone to school with Frank's older brother before Vietnam claimed him in '68. But knowing someone didn't make the paperwork any easier or the statistics any less clear. "We can't file a missing person report until she's been gone 24 hours, he explained. "That's policy, but I'll put the word out to the patrol units, have them keep an eye open." Frank drove home through streets that seemed different somehow, as if someone had adjusted the lighting just enough to make everything unfamiliar. Their apartment was on the second floor of a building that had been elegant once, back when the neighborhood was full of families who worked at the steel mill and believed their children would have better lives than they did. Now it was full of people who were hanging on, hoping the next month's rent wouldn't break them. The apartment felt huge without Maria's presence. Frank sat at the kitchen table they'd bought at a yard sale 3 years ago, drinking coffee that had turned bitter and cold, staring at the apple pie she'd never brought home. The thermos sat on the counter, still warm. He called her sister in Cicero. No answer. He called her best friend from high school who lived in Bridgeport. Carmen hadn't heard from her in 2 weeks, not since they'd talked about Christmas plans. Frank gave her his number and asked her to call if Maria contacted her. The television in the living room droned through the evening news. Another factory closure, another political scandal, another reminder that the world was getting harder and less predictable. Frank turned it off and sat in the silence, listening to the radiator knock and the couple upstairs argue about money. At midnight, he drove back to the garage and sat in his office, smoking cigarettes and staring at the phone. The garage felt different too, like a place he'd visited in a dream rather than somewhere he'd worked every day for 8 years. The familiar smells of motor oil and metal and the coffee that had been brewing too long all seemed sharper, more present. By dawn, Frank had gone through half a pack of cigarettes and developed a theory about Maria's disappearance that would have sounded paranoid to anyone who hadn't spent the night alone with their thoughts. Someone had taken her. Not randomly, not accidentally, but specifically. Someone who knew her routine, who knew she walked from the diner to the garage every night at 6:15, who knew she'd be carrying whatever tips she'd made and maybe $20 from the register. The theory felt solid in the grey light of morning, built from the same kind of logical thinking that helped him diagnose engine problems. You looked at the symptoms, considered what could cause them, eliminated the possibilities that didn't fit the evidence. Maria didn't disappear voluntarily. She didn't have accidents. Someone had made a conscious decision to take her, and that someone was still out there, probably assuming no one would look too hard for a waitress who lived in a neighborhood where people minded their own business. When Sergeant Kerner called at 8:30 to say there'd been no sign of her, and they could now file the official missing person report, Frank was already dressed and ready to begin looking for her himself. The official investigation would follow procedures and protocols and probably conclude that Maria Kowalski had simply chosen to start a new life somewhere else. The unofficial investigation would start with the assumption that someone in Chicago knew exactly what had happened to her, and that person could be found if you knew where to look and how to ask the right questions. The snow had stopped falling, but the sky remained grey and heavy with the promise of more. Frank locked the garage and walked to his car, carrying the thermos Maria had filled with coffee she'd never drunk. He had names to collect and places to visit, and questions to ask that the police wouldn't think to ask. He had time and patience and nothing left to lose except the hope that he might find her alive. The investigation was about to begin. The missing person report took 43 minutes to file and felt like a bureaucratic ritual designed to discourage rather than help. Detective Ray Castellanos, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and coffee stains on his shirt, asked the same questions Frank had already answered for Sergeant Kerner, writing everything down in handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone who'd given up caring about details years ago. "Height, weight, any distinguishing marks?" Castellanos said, not looking up from the form. Last known clothing, any medical conditions, history of depression or substance abuse. Frank described the small scar on Maria's chin from when she'd fallen off her bike as a child. The way she always wore her grandmother's wedding ring on a chain around her neck. How she'd been excited about Christmas shopping and had been saving money for months to buy her nephew the basketball shoes he wanted. None of it seemed relevant to the detective, who was already moving on to the next section of the form. Any marital problems, financial difficulties, history of infidelity on either side? We were fine, Frank said. We've been together 6 years, married for 3. No problems, no debts except the car payment, no reason for her to leave. Castellanos made a note that probably said something like, "Husband denies problems," and moved on to the next question. Frank had seen this kind of efficiency before. In mechanics who'd been doing the same job so long, they could rebuild an engine without thinking about it. Castellanos was processing Maria's disappearance the same way, following a checklist that covered the most common scenarios without really considering whether this particular case might be different. "We'll circulate her description to all units," Castellanos said, handing Frank a business card that had been photocopied so many times the edges were grey. "Check with her friends and family. Canvass the area between the diner and your garage. Most of these cases resolve themselves within a few days." Frank left the station with the certainty that Maria had already been categorized and filed away, another statistic in a city that processed thousands of missing person reports every year. The detective would make some phone calls and fill out some paperwork, and wait for her to either turn up on her own or become someone else's problem. The diner where Maria worked was a narrow building squeezed between a laundromat and a store that sold used appliances, the kind of place that had been serving the same menu for 30 years and saw no reason to change. Betty Kowalski, still no relation despite the coincidence that had brought Maria to work there, was behind the counter when Frank arrived, wiping down surfaces that were already clean and arranging sugar dispensers that were already perfectly aligned. "Any word?" she asked, though his expression had already given her the answer. Betty was in her 50s, a woman who'd been running the diner since her husband died in 1979 and who treated her employees like family because she'd never had children of her own. She knew Maria's schedule better than anyone, knew her habits and her moods and the customers who left good tips versus the ones who complained about everything. "She was nervous yesterday," Betty said, pouring coffee Frank didn't want, but would drink anyway. Not scared exactly, but distracted. Like she was thinking about something she couldn't figure out. Frank had lived with Maria long enough to know her moods, and he hadn't noticed anything unusual when she'd left for work that morning. She'd been excited about the snow, had talked about how it would make the neighborhood look like a Christmas card, had kissed him goodbye and promised to bring home pie if there was any left. Did she say anything specific? Mention anyone giving her trouble? Betty shook her head, but something in her expression suggested there was more to the story. Frank waited, the way he waited when a customer was trying to explain a problem with their car, but wasn't sure how to describe what was wrong. "There was this guy," she said finally. "Been coming in maybe 2-3 weeks. Always sat in Maria's section. Always ordered the same thing, coffee, toast, no butter. Never caused trouble, always paid his bill, but what? He watched her too much. Not like the construction workers who come in and flirt with all the girls. This was different, quieter, like he was studying her." Frank felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the coffee. What did he look like? Thin, maybe 40 years old, dark hair, always needed a shave, wore a brown coat that had seen better days, spoke with an accent, Italian, maybe, or Greek. Polite enough, but his eyes, Betty shrugged, made me uncomfortable. "When did you last see him?" 2 days ago, Monday. He sat there for an hour, ordered 3 cups of coffee, kept checking his watch like he was waiting for something, left a decent tip, but when Maria went to clean his table, she found this. Betty reached under the counter and pulled out a napkin that had been folded into a small square. Frank unfolded it carefully, revealing a phone number written in blue ink, along with a single word, "Soon." The handwriting was neat, controlled, the kind of penmanship that suggested education and patience. The phone number had a 312 area code, somewhere in Chicago. But beyond that, it told Frank nothing except that someone had been planning something involving his wife. "Did Maria say anything about this?" "She threw it away," Betty said. "I found it in the trash after she left. Figured it was just another creep trying to ask her out, but now—" She gestured vaguely at the empty space where Maria should have been. Frank pocketed the napkin and left the diner with his first real clue, though he wasn't sure what to do with it. The phone number could belong to anyone. The man who'd been watching Maria or someone else entirely. The word soon suggested planning, timing, a specific moment when something was supposed to happen. Yesterday at 6:15, when Maria was walking from the diner to the garage, carrying apple pie and expecting to spend a quiet evening with her husband. The route between the diner and the garage took her past 3 alleys, 2 parking lots, and the empty building that had once housed a furniture store before the owner retired and moved to Arizona. Frank walked it slowly, looking for signs he'd missed the night before. Tire tracks in the slush, scuff marks on the pavement, anything that might indicate a struggle or suggest where someone might have taken her. In the alley behind Palmer's Hardware, he found a piece of fabric caught on a chain-link fence. Dark blue, the same color as the sweater Maria had been wearing when she left for work. The fabric was small, maybe torn off when someone brushed against the fence, but it was positioned at about shoulder height, consistent with someone being forced or dragged through the narrow passage between the fence and the building. Frank left the fabric where it was and called the police station from the payphone outside Palmer's. Detective Castellanos sounded annoyed at being bothered, but agreed to send someone to look at what Frank had found. While he waited for the patrol car, Frank studied the alley more carefully. The passage led to a loading dock behind the hardware store, where delivery trucks unloaded merchandise during business hours. After 5 o'clock, it would be empty and dark, shielded from the street by the building and the fence. Someone could park a car there and wait, watching the sidewalk until Maria appeared, then grab her and drive away without anyone seeing from the street. Officer Jennifer Walsh arrived 20 minutes later, a young woman who looked like she'd graduated from the police academy about 15 minutes ago. She examined the fabric with the kind of serious attention Frank had been hoping to see from Detective Castellanos, photographing it from multiple angles and making notes about its position and condition. "Could be from anyone," she said, but she bagged it carefully and labeled it with the case number. "A lot of people cut through this alley as a shortcut to Racine Avenue. How many of them are missing?" Frank asked. Walsh gave him a look that was sympathetic but professional. "I know this is hard, Mr. Kowalski. We're going to do everything we can to find your wife. But you have to let us do our job and not try to investigate this yourself." Frank nodded and made the appropriate noises about cooperation and letting the professionals handle everything. But as Walsh drove away with the only physical evidence they'd found, he was already planning his next move. The police would test the fabric and file a report and add it to Maria's case file, where it would sit until something more urgent came along. Frank would do what he should have done from the beginning, start asking questions in places where the police couldn't or wouldn't go. The phone number on the napkin bothered him more than the fabric. Someone had planned this carefully enough to scout Maria's routine, patient enough to sit in the diner for weeks, bold enough to leave a message that could be traced back to them. That level of confidence suggested either stupidity or connections that made them feel untouchable. Frank spent the rest of the morning calling every garage and body shop on the south side, asking about the man Betty had described. Mechanics knew their neighborhoods, knew who belonged and who didn't, noticed things that other people missed, but nobody recognized the description, and nobody had seen anything unusual on Tuesday evening. At noon, he drove to the library on State Street and asked the librarian how to do a reverse phone lookup. She showed him to a table with phone directories for the entire Chicago area, massive books that contained thousands of numbers organized by exchange and prefix. Finding the number from the napkin took 45 minutes of cross-referencing and page-turning, but eventually Frank found what he was looking for. The number belonged to a payphone outside Salvatore's restaurant on North Taylor Street, in the heart of what everyone knew was Italian mob territory. Frank stared at the address for a long time, understanding that he'd just crossed from missing person case into something much more dangerous. Maria hadn't been grabbed by a random predator or taken by someone who'd seen an opportunity and acted on impulse. Someone connected to organized crime had been watching her, planning something involving her, using a payphone in Little Italy to coordinate whatever they were doing. Frank drove home through afternoon traffic that seemed heavier and more aggressive than usual, as if the entire city had become impatient with itself. Their apartment felt like a museum dedicated to the life he'd had 2 days ago, full of Maria's things, waiting for her to come back and use them. Her coffee cup in the sink, the book she'd been reading face down on the nightstand, the Christmas presents she'd already bought and hidden in the closet. He made a sandwich he didn't eat and sat at the kitchen table with the phone book, looking up everything he could find about Salvatore's restaurant. It was listed in the yellow pages under Italian cuisine, with a small ad that emphasized family atmosphere and traditional recipes. No mention of the rumors everyone knew about back rooms where men in expensive suits made decisions that affected everything from construction contracts to union elections. The restaurant had been owned by the Torino family for 3 generations, according to a newspaper article Frank found at the library. Vincent Torino, the current owner, was described as a respected businessman and community leader who donated money to local charities and sponsored little league teams. The article didn't mention that Vincent's brother had been indicted twice on racketeering charges, or that federal investigators had been trying to build a case against the family for years without success. As the afternoon wore on, Frank realized he was facing a choice that would determine everything that happened next. He could trust the police to investigate Maria's disappearance through official channels, following procedures and protocols that were designed to protect citizens but also to avoid conflicts with powerful interests. Or he could accept that his wife had somehow become involved with people who operated outside the law, and that finding her would require him to do the same. The decision should have been difficult, but it wasn't. Frank had grown up in neighborhoods where people solved their own problems because calling the police was either useless or dangerous. He'd learned to fix engines by taking them apart and studying how the pieces fit together, by understanding that every problem had a solution if you were patient enough to find it and determined enough to see it through. Maria was somewhere in Chicago, alive or dead, held by people who thought a mechanic from the South Side wouldn't have the intelligence or the connections to find her. They were probably right about the connections, but they'd made a serious mistake about his intelligence and his determination. Frank had 8 hours of daylight left, a car that ran perfectly, and a phone number that connected his missing wife to some very dangerous people. The investigation was about to become something else entirely. That evening, Frank sat in his car outside Salvatore's restaurant, watching men in expensive coats come and go through the front door. The restaurant was busy, filled with families celebrating someone's birthday, and couples on dates and groups of friends catching up over wine and conversation. From the outside, it looked exactly like what the Yellow Pages claimed it was, a place where Italian families served traditional food in a warm, welcoming atmosphere. But Frank had noticed things that wouldn't be obvious to casual observers. The way certain customers were escorted to a back room instead of being seated in the main dining area. The man in the grey suit who stood near the front door, greeting everyone but watching the street, with the kind of attention that suggested security rather than hospitality. The black Cadillac parked in the alley behind the restaurant, engine running, driver waiting for someone who might need to leave quickly. At 7:30, Frank got out of his car and walked to the payphone that matched the number on the napkin. It was positioned where someone could watch both the restaurant's front door and the alley, where they could coordinate timing and logistics while staying connected to whatever was happening inside. Frank lifted the receiver and heard the dial tone, ordinary and innocent, giving no hint of what conversations it might have carried 2 days ago. A man emerged from the restaurant's back door and walked toward the Cadillac, moving with the kind of casual confidence that came from knowing you were protected. Frank recognized him from Betty's description: thin, dark hair, wearing the same brown coat that had seen better days. The man who'd been watching Maria, who'd left the napkin with the phone number, who'd been planning something that had finally happened on Tuesday evening. Frank followed the Cadillac at a distance that would have made a driving instructor proud, staying far enough back to avoid being noticed, but close enough to see where it was going. The car headed north on Ashland, then east on Division, eventually parking outside a warehouse in an industrial area that was mostly empty after business hours. The thin man got out of the Cadillac and used a key to open a side door in the warehouse. Frank parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot, staying in the shadows between streetlights, moving with the kind of careful patience he'd learned during 2 years in the army before a back injury had sent him home to Chicago. Through a window that someone had forgotten to cover, Frank could see into a room that had been converted into an office. The thin man was there, along with 2 others Frank didn't recognize. They were talking, but he couldn't hear what they were saying. One of them handed the thin man an envelope, thick enough to contain either money or documents. The thin man opened it, counted whatever was inside, and nodded. Frank had found the people who'd taken Maria, but he still didn't know why they'd taken her or where she was now. The warehouse was too big to search without being discovered, and calling the police would probably result in everyone disappearing before the patrol cars arrived. Frank needed more information, more proof, more understanding of who these people were and what they wanted. He also needed help, though he wasn't sure where to find it. The kind of help that could navigate the world he was discovering, where phone calls were made from payphones and conversations happened in back rooms, and problems were solved through methods that weren't covered in police procedural manuals. Frank was a mechanic who understood engines and transmissions and brake systems, but he was beginning to understand that finding his wife would require expertise in systems that were much more complex and dangerous. As he walked back to his car, Frank made a mental inventory of everything he'd learned. Maria had been watched for weeks by someone connected to the Italian mob. She'd been taken from an alley behind Palmer's Hardware, probably by the same person who'd been watching her. That person was now meeting with associates in a warehouse, exchanging money or documents, planning whatever came next. Frank drove home through streets that seemed different again, as if someone had redrawn the map of Chicago while he wasn't paying attention. The city he'd known all his life, predictable, working class, manageable, had revealed itself to be something else entirely. A place where ordinary people could disappear without trace, where power operated through invisible networks, where asking the wrong questions could make you disappear too. But Frank had crossed a line that afternoon, and there was no going back. He'd seen the faces of the men who'd taken Maria, knew where they met, understood that they were part of something bigger than a simple kidnapping. Tomorrow, he would begin learning how that world worked and how to operate within it. Tonight, he would plan his next moves and prepare for a kind of investigation that the police couldn't or wouldn't conduct. Maria was out there somewhere, and Frank was going to find her, no matter what it cost him. Frank didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pencil, drawing diagrams that looked like the wiring schematics he used to troubleshoot electrical problems in cars. Instead of alternators and batteries, he was mapping connections between people. The thin man who'd watched Maria, the restaurant where the phone calls were made, the warehouse where money changed hands, the men in expensive suits who moved through Little Italy like they owned it. By morning, he had filled 6 pages with names, addresses, times, and questions. The questions outnumbered everything else. Why Maria? What did they want from a waitress who lived paycheck to paycheck and had never hurt anyone? How long had they been planning this? And most importantly, where was she now? Frank called the garage and told his assistant, Tommy Kowalski, no relation, just another coincidence in a neighborhood where half the families had come from the same villages in Poland, that he'd be closed for a few days due to a family emergency. Tommy had been working for him for 2 years and was competent enough to handle the simple repairs and oil changes that kept the business running. "Everything okay, Frank?" Tommy asked. "You sound like hell." "Maria's missing," Frank said, which was true enough without being the whole truth. "Police are looking for her, but I need to check with her family in Milwaukee." The lie came easily, which surprised him. 2 days ago, Frank had been the kind of person who told the truth reflexively, who believed that honesty was always the best policy and that problems could be solved through proper channels. Now he was learning to navigate a world where the truth could get you killed and proper channels were designed to protect the wrong people. After hanging up with Tommy, Frank drove to the Chicago Public Library and spent 3 hours researching everything he could find about the Torino family and their associates. Newspaper articles from the past decade painted a picture of an organization that had evolved with the times, moving away from the flashy violence of earlier generations toward more sophisticated operations that were harder to prosecute. Vincent Torino, the restaurant owner, had been investigated by the FBI in 1982, but never charged with anything. His brother Anthony had served 18 months for tax evasion, but was otherwise clean, at least on paper. Their cousin Michael had been linked to a construction company that had won several city contracts, despite not being the lowest bidder, but again, nothing that resulted in criminal charges. The family operated through layers of legitimate businesses: restaurants, construction companies, trucking firms, waste management services. Money moved through complex networks that made it difficult to trace illegal profits, and decisions were made through intermediaries who could deny knowledge if questioned by law enforcement. Frank found a reference to the warehouse he'd observed the night before. It was owned by Torino Logistics, a trucking company that specialized in moving freight between Chicago and cities throughout the Midwest. The business address was listed as the same location where Frank had watched the thin man receive his envelope. At 2 o'clock, Frank drove to the warehouse district and parked where he could observe the building without being noticed. He brought sandwiches and coffee and prepared to spend however long it took to understand the rhythm of the operation. Who came and went? When were they most active? What kind of security did they maintain? The warehouse looked legitimate during business hours. Trucks arrived and departed, workers loaded and unloaded cargo, supervisors checked paperwork and coordinated schedules. But Frank noticed things that didn't quite fit the image of a normal trucking company. Too many men in suits for a blue-collar operation. Too much attention paid to vehicles that weren't part of their fleet. Too many conversations that stopped when strangers approached. Around 4 o'clock, Frank recognized one of the men from the restaurant, not the thin man who'd been watching Maria, but one of the others he'd seen in the back room. This man was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and the kind of expensive overcoat that suggested authority. He spent 20 minutes walking through the warehouse, talking to supervisors and examining cargo manifests, behaving like someone who owned the place, or at least had significant influence over its operations. Frank followed him when he left, maintaining the careful distance he'd learned the night before. The man drove to a small office building on West Grand Avenue, where he spent an hour meeting with people Frank couldn't identify. When he emerged, he was carrying a briefcase that hadn't been with him when he went in. The pattern continued for the rest of the afternoon. Brief meetings at different locations, always involving the exchange of documents or money, always conducted with the kind of casual efficiency that suggested routine rather than emergency. Frank was watching the daily operations of an organization that moved money and influence through Chicago, like blood through arteries, touching everything without leaving obvious traces. By evening, Frank had identified 3 more locations connected to the Torino network: the office building on Grand Avenue, a social club on Taylor Street, and a parking garage near the Loop, where several meetings took place in cars rather than buildings. He was beginning to understand that finding Maria would require him to penetrate a system that had been designed specifically to resist outside investigation. That night, Frank made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Carmen Valdez, Maria's best friend from high school, who worked as a secretary for a law firm downtown. Frank had met Carmen several times at family gatherings and remembered her as someone who asked good questions and paid attention to details that other people missed. "I need a favor," Frank told her, after explaining that Maria was missing and the police investigation wasn't making progress. "Your law firm handles criminal cases, right? I need information about how to investigate organized crime without getting killed." Carmen was quiet for a long moment. "Frank, what exactly are you planning to do?" "Whatever it takes to find my wife." "That's what I was afraid you'd say." Another pause. "My boss, Mr. Brennan, used to be a federal prosecutor before he went into private practice. He worked organized crime cases for 15 years. I could ask him for advice, but Frank, these people don't just threaten you. They make examples of people who cause problems." "They already made an example," Frank said. "They took Maria." The second call was to his cousin Eddie, who worked construction and had grown up in neighborhoods where you learned early to distinguish between people who talked tough and people who actually were tough. Eddie had spent 2 years in Stateville Penitentiary for aggravated assault and had come out with connections that legitimate citizens didn't possess. "I need to buy a gun," Frank told him. "Jesus, Frank. What kind of trouble are you in?" Frank explained about Maria's disappearance and what he'd discovered about the people who'd taken her. Eddie listened without interrupting, asking only a few questions about specific details. "These aren't the kind of people you can intimidate with a gun," Eddie said finally. "If you pull a weapon on them, you better be ready to use it, and you better be ready for them to use theirs, and they'll have better guns and more experience using them." "So what do you suggest?" "Information," Eddie said. "These guys operate on reputation and fear, but they're also businessmen. They don't kill people randomly. It's bad for business. If they took Maria, there's a reason. Figure out what they want, and you might be able to negotiate for her release. And if they don't want to negotiate, then you'll need more help than I can give you." Frank spent the weekend learning about a world he'd never imagined existed. Carmen's boss, James Brennan, agreed to meet with Frank on Sunday afternoon at his home in Lincoln Park. Brennan was a thin, intense man in his 60s who spoke about organized crime with the clinical precision of a surgeon discussing cancer. "The modern mob is fundamentally a business organization," Brennan explained over coffee in his study. "They provide illegal services, gambling, loan sharking, protection, labor racketeering, and they eliminate competition through intimidation rather than violence whenever possible. Violence is expensive and draws unwanted attention from law enforcement." Frank described what he'd observed at the warehouse and the restaurant, and Brennan nodded, as if the details confirmed something he'd already suspected. "The Torinos are middle management in a larger organization," Brennan said. "They control territory on the south side and handle logistics for operations throughout the Midwest. If they're involved in your wife's disappearance, it's because she saw something or learned something that threatens their business." "Like what?" "Could be anything. A conversation she overheard, a license plate she noticed, a face she recognized. These organizations survive by maintaining strict separation between their legitimate businesses and their illegal activities. Anyone who can connect those two worlds becomes a liability." Brennan pulled a file folder from his desk and showed Frank photographs of men in suits entering and leaving federal courthouses. Most of the faces were unfamiliar, but Frank recognized several from his surveillance of the restaurant and warehouse. "The FBI has been trying to build a RICO case against the Torino organization for 3 years, Brennan said. "They have surveillance, wiretaps, financial records, but they're still missing the kind of direct evidence that would convince a jury. A witness who could testify about specific illegal activities would be extremely valuable to them." "You think they took Maria because they're afraid she'll become a witness?" "I think they took her because they're afraid she already is one, whether she knows it or not." Frank left the meeting with a clearer understanding of what he was facing, but also with more questions than answers. If Maria had witnessed something that threatened the Torino organization, why hadn't she mentioned it to him? What could a waitress in a neighborhood diner have seen that would matter to federal investigators? That evening, Frank returned to the diner and interviewed Betty again, this time asking more specific questions about Maria's recent behavior and the customers who'd been coming in during the past month. "The man who was watching her wasn't the only new face," Betty said. "Oh, we've had more strangers than usual, people who didn't fit the neighborhood. Better dressed, driving nicer cars, asking questions about directions and local businesses." "What kind of questions?" "Nothing specific, just general conversation. But they were learning things, who lived where, who worked where, what time people usually came and went, like they were mapping the neighborhood." Frank realized that Maria's disappearance might be part of something larger than he'd understood. The Torino organization wasn't just interested in his wife, they were interested in the entire area around the diner. Something was happening in the neighborhood that required them to gather intelligence and eliminate potential witnesses. He drove home through streets that looked different for the third time in a week, as if someone kept adjusting his perception of the city. The Chicago he'd known all his life, predictable, working class, manageable, was revealing layers of complexity that he'd never suspected. Power structures that operated through invisible networks, conflicts that played out through subtle intimidation rather than open violence, decisions that affected ordinary people who never learned they'd been affected. Frank understood now that finding Maria would require him to become something he'd never been before. Not just a mechanic who fixed engines, but an investigator who could navigate dangerous territory without getting lost. Not just a husband looking for his wife, but someone who could match the patience and intelligence of people who'd been playing these games for decades. On Monday morning, Frank made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. He was going to infiltrate the Torino organization, not as an undercover police officer or federal agent, but as someone they might find useful. He was going to offer his services as a mechanic who could repair vehicles and ask no questions about where they'd been or what they'd been used for. The plan was dangerous and probably stupid, but it was also the only way Frank could think of to get close enough to the people who'd taken Maria to learn where she was and what they wanted. Frank had spent his entire adult life taking apart complicated machines and figuring out how to fix them. Now he was going to take apart a criminal organization and figure out how to extract his wife from it. Eddie helped him prepare by teaching him how to talk and act around people who settled disputes with violence rather than words. Carmen's boss provided him with background information about the specific individuals he'd be dealing with and the kinds of services they might need from a reliable mechanic. "Remember," Brennan told him during their final meeting, "these people are paranoid by necessity. They'll test you in ways you can't anticipate. Don't try to be someone you're not. They'll spot a fake immediately. Be exactly what you are, a skilled mechanic who needs work and doesn't ask inconvenient questions." Frank spent Tuesday practicing his approach, rehearsing the story he'd tell and the attitude he'd project. He was Frank Kowalski, a mechanic whose garage had failed because of the recession and who was looking for work that paid cash and didn't involve dealing with insurance companies or government regulations. He was desperate enough to work for questionable clients, skilled enough to be valuable, and smart enough to keep his mouth shut. Wednesday morning, Frank drove to Salvatore's restaurant and asked to speak with Vincent Torino about possible employment. He was told to wait, and he waited for 3 hours before being escorted to the same back room where he'd seen men in expensive suits making decisions about things that weren't listed on the menu. Vincent Torino was a heavy-set man in his 50s who looked like everyone's idea of a successful restaurant owner. Friendly smile, firm handshake, the kind of casual authority that came from being respected in the community. But Frank noticed the way other people deferred to him, and the fact that 2 men who were obviously bodyguards waited just outside the room during their conversation. "I hear you're looking for work," Torino said, settling into a chair that probably cost more than Frank made in a month. "My garage went under last week," Frank said, which was true enough if you defined went under as temporarily closed. "Banks are calling in loans, suppliers want cash up front, customers can't afford to fix their cars. I need work that pays immediately and doesn't involve a lot of paperwork." Torino studied Frank with the kind of attention mechanics usually reserved for engines that made unusual noises. "What kind of work are you qualified to do?" "Anything involving engines, transmissions, electrical systems, 20 years experience with domestic and foreign cars, light trucks, motorcycles. I can also do body work if you need vehicles repaired discreetly." The word discreetly hung in the air between them like smoke. Torino's expression didn't change, but Frank sensed that he'd said something significant, that he'd indicated awareness of needs that legitimate businesses didn't usually have. "Where did you work before you had your own garage?" Frank gave him the names of 3 shops where he'd actually worked, knowing that anyone who checked would find records of his employment and positive recommendations from supervisors. The beauty of his cover story was that most of it was true. Frank really was an experienced mechanic who really was having financial problems, even if those problems were self-imposed rather than economic. "I might have some work for you," Torino said finally. "Occasional jobs, cash payment, no questions asked, interested? Depends on the work and the pay. Vehicle maintenance, some modifications, maybe some emergency repairs. The kind of work that needs to be done quickly and forgotten immediately." Frank nodded, as if he understood exactly what kind of modifications and emergency repairs Torino was talking about. "I can do that." Torino reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card with only a phone number printed on it. "Call this number Thursday afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock. Someone will tell you where to go and what to bring." Frank pocketed the card and stood to leave, understanding that the interview was over and that he'd passed whatever test Torino had been administering. He was now officially connected to the Torino organization, with access to their operations and the possibility of discovering what had happened to his wife. Walking back to his car, Frank realized that he'd just crossed another line, one that separated people who followed the law from people who made their own rules. He was no longer just investigating Maria's disappearance. He was actively participating in the world that had taken her. The question now was whether he could maintain his cover long enough to find her, and whether he'd still be the same person when this was over. That evening, Frank sat in his empty apartment and called Detective Castellanos to provide an update on his wife's case. The detective sounded tired and distracted, as if Maria's disappearance was already fading into the background of more urgent priorities. "No new leads," Castellanos said. "We've checked with hospitals, shelters, bus stations. Her description has been circulated to all precincts. If she's in Chicago, someone will eventually spot her." Frank almost told him about the warehouse, the restaurant, the business card with the phone number. But he understood now that official investigation would only drive the Torino organization deeper underground, making it even harder to find Maria. Frank had to see this through on his own, using methods that the police couldn't or wouldn't use. "Keep me informed," Frank said, which was what Castellanos expected to hear. "We will," Castellanos replied, which was what Frank expected to hear. Neither of them believed what they were saying, but both understood the game they were playing. The police would continue their investigation through proper channels, and Frank would continue his through whatever channels proved necessary. With luck, one of them would find Maria before it was too late. Frank spent the rest of the evening preparing for his first assignment with the Torino organization, checking his tools and reviewing everything he knew about automotive modification and repair. Tomorrow afternoon he would call the number on Vincent Torino's business card and take another step deeper into a world where ordinary rules didn't apply and mistakes could be fatal. Somewhere in Chicago, Maria was waiting for him to find her. Frank intended to do exactly that, no matter what it required him to become. Chapter 4. Thursday afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock, Frank called the number from a payphone outside a gas station on Western Avenue. A voice he didn't recognize gave him an address in Cicero and told him to bring tools for electrical work and body repair. The call lasted less than 30 seconds, but Frank understood that he was about to see how the Torino organization operated when they thought no one was watching. The address led to a body shop that looked legitimate from the outside. Professional signs, customer parking, the kind of place where suburban families brought their cars after minor accidents. But the work bays were empty, except for 2 vehicles that definitely hadn't been damaged in normal traffic incidents. The first was a black Lincoln Continental with bullet holes in the passenger door and bloodstains on the upholstery. The second was a blue Chevrolet van with Illinois plates that had been reported stolen 3 days earlier, according to the radio reports Frank had been monitoring since Maria's disappearance. "You must be the new guy," said a man who introduced himself only as Tony. He was short and muscular, with the kind of scars on his knuckles that suggested experience with physical persuasion. "Vinny says you're good with electrical problems." Frank examined the Lincoln and quickly identified what needed to be done. The bullets had damaged the wiring harness behind the dashboard, disabling the lights and turn signals. The blood would have to be cleaned completely, and the upholstery replaced with something that matched the original. The work would take 6 hours and cost about $300 in parts, but it would make the car look like nothing had ever happened to it. "How long?" Tony asked. 2 days if you want it done right. 1 day if you just need it to run." "1 day. We need it tonight." Frank spent the afternoon rewiring the Lincoln while Tony worked on the stolen van, changing the color from blue to white and replacing the license plates with ones that belonged to a similar vehicle registered in Indiana. They worked in efficient silence, 2 professionals solving practical problems without discussing why the problems existed or what would happen to the vehicles when they were finished. At 6 o'clock, a man Frank recognized from his surveillance of the restaurant arrived to inspect their work. This was Angelo Torino, Vincent's younger brother, who had served time for tax evasion and was rumored to handle the family's more violent operations. Angelo examined both vehicles with the thoroughness of someone who understood that sloppy work could lead to prison sentences or worse. "Good," he said finally, handing Tony an envelope thick with cash. "The Lincoln goes to Jimmy's lot on Roosevelt. The van gets delivered to Milwaukee tomorrow morning." Frank packed his tools and prepared to leave, but Angelo stopped him at the door. "Vinny wants to see you at the restaurant tonight. 9 o'clock. The summons could mean anything. Another job, a test of his reliability, or the discovery that his cover story hadn't been as convincing as he'd hoped. Frank drove home through evening traffic, trying to prepare himself for whatever Vincent Torino wanted to discuss. At 8:30, Frank returned to Salvatore's restaurant and was immediately escorted to the back room where he'd first met Vincent. This time, the restaurant owner wasn't alone. 3 other men sat around a table covered with papers that looked like financial records and shipping manifests. "Frank, I want you to meet some associates," Vincent said, making introductions that consisted only of first names and handshakes. "These gentlemen have a problem that requires your particular skills." The problem, as explained by a man called Joseph, involved a truck that had been in an accident while carrying cargo that couldn't be reported to insurance companies or police. The truck was currently hidden in a warehouse outside the city, but it needed to be repaired and returned to service before its absence was noticed by people who weren't supposed to know it had ever left its regular route. "The cargo is fine," Joseph said, "but the truck took some damage when the driver had to leave the highway quickly. We need someone who can fix it without asking questions about why it was off its normal route." Frank understood that he was being offered a chance to see deeper into the Torino organization's operations. The truck was probably carrying drugs, stolen goods, or money that needed to be moved without official documentation. Repairing it would give him access to one of their storage facilities and possibly information about other aspects of their business. "What kind of damage?" Frank asked. "Front-end collision, some electrical problems, maybe transmission trouble. The driver says it barely made it to the warehouse. I'll need to see it to give you an accurate estimate." Joseph handed him a business card with another address, this one in an industrial area near Midway Airport. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Ask for Carl, he manages the facility." Frank pocketed the card and prepared to leave, but Vincent gestured for him to remain seated. "Frank, before you go, I want to make something clear. The people we do business with value discretion above everything else. They don't appreciate curiosity about matters that don't concern them directly." The warning was delivered in the same friendly tone Vincent used with customers who complained about their dinner, but Frank understood the implications. Ask too many questions, show too much interest in things beyond his immediate responsibilities, and he might find himself in the same situation as Maria. "I understand," Frank said. "I'm a mechanic, not an investigative reporter." "Good. Carl will have everything you need tomorrow, parts, tools, whatever the job requires." Frank drove home with the certainty that he was getting closer to the people who'd taken Maria, but also with the growing understanding that infiltrating their organization was only the first step. Even if he discovered where she was being held, extracting her safely would require resources and expertise that he didn't possess. That night, Frank called Carmen and asked her to arrange another meeting with her boss, James Brennan. The former federal prosecutor listened to Frank's description of his day with the kind of intense attention that suggested professional rather than casual interest. "You're in deeper than you realize," Brennan said. "The operations you're describing, vehicle modification, cargo transportation, coordination between multiple facilities, these are the kinds of activities that federal task forces spend years trying to document." "Does that help me find Maria?" "It might. If the Torinos are involved in the kind of large-scale operations you're seeing, there are probably federal agents already investigating them. You might be able to trade information for assistance." Brennan made a phone call to someone he identified only as an old colleague and arranged a meeting for the following evening. Frank would have a chance to speak with federal agents who were already working the Torino case, but the conversation would be unofficial and off the record. "Remember," Brennan warned, "federal agents have their own priorities. Finding your wife might not be as important to them as building their case against the organization. Be careful what you promise them, and don't expect them to risk their investigation to help you." Friday morning, Frank arrived at the warehouse near Midway Airport and was met by Carl, a nervous man in his 40s who managed the facility for people who preferred to remain anonymous. The truck he'd been asked to repair was a semi-trailer rig that had definitely been in a serious collision, though not the kind that usually occurred on public highways. The front end was damaged by what looked like gunfire rather than impact with another vehicle. The windshield was spider-webbed with bullet holes, and the driver's door had been pried open with tools that left distinctive marks. Someone had attacked the truck and its driver, probably in an attempt to steal whatever cargo it had been carrying. "What happened to the driver?" Frank asked while examining the damage. "He's fine," Carl said quickly, "recovering at home." Frank spent the morning assessing the repairs that would be needed and the parts that would have to be ordered. The work was extensive but not technically difficult, mostly replacing damaged components and rewiring systems that had been destroyed by gunfire. What interested him more than the mechanical problems was the cargo area of the trailer. The interior had been modified with hidden compartments designed to conceal items from casual inspection. False walls, concealed panels, spaces that could hold significant quantities of drugs, money, or weapons without being detected by anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Frank had stumbled into the logistics center for a major smuggling operation. While Carl made phone calls to arrange for parts delivery, Frank explored the warehouse and discovered that the damaged truck wasn't the only modified vehicle being stored there. 3 other trucks, 2 vans, and a mobile home had all been equipped with hidden compartments and false documentation. The Torino organization was running a transportation network that could move illegal cargo throughout the Midwest without detection. Frank also found something that made his hands shake when he picked it up: Maria's purse, sitting on a shelf in Carl's office like a piece of lost property waiting for someone to claim it. Inside were her driver's license, credit cards, the $23 in tips she'd earned on her last day of work, and a small notebook where she'd written phone numbers and addresses that Frank didn't recognize. Carl returned from his phone calls and found Frank standing in the office doorway, holding Maria's purse like evidence in a murder trial. "Where did this come from?" Frank asked, keeping his voice steady through an effort of will that surprised him. Carl looked at the purse and then at Frank, and something in his expression suggested that he'd just realized he'd made a serious mistake. "I don't know anything about that," he said. "Must belong to one of the driver's girlfriends." "This belongs to my wife. She's been missing for a week." The 2 men stared at each other across the small office, both understanding that the conversation had just become much more dangerous than either of them had planned. Carl reached for the phone on his desk, probably to call Vincent Torino or one of his associates, but Frank grabbed his wrist before he could dial. "Where is she?" Frank asked. "I don't know what you're talking about." Frank had never hit another person in anger, but he found himself considering it now with a clarity that frightened him. Maria's purse meant that she'd been here, in this warehouse, probably as a prisoner. Carl knew what had happened to her, and he was going to tell Frank everything he knew one way or another. "The notebook in her purse has addresses," Frank said, still holding Carl's wrist. "If something happens to me, those addresses get delivered to the FBI along with everything I've learned about this operation." It was a bluff. Frank hadn't had time to study the notebook carefully, and he didn't know if the addresses were significant, but Carl's reaction told him he'd guessed correctly. The man's face went pale and he stopped trying to reach for the phone. "She saw something she wasn't supposed to see," Carl said finally. "At the diner where she worked. One of our drivers was there, talking about a delivery that got intercepted. She heard him mention this address and some other details. So you kidnapped her." "We were going to talk to her, find out what she knew, maybe offer her some money to forget about it. But she tried to run when they approached her and things got complicated." Frank felt something cold and heavy settle in his chest. "Where is she now?" "I don't know. I swear I don't know. Vincent and Angelo handle that kind of decision. They moved her somewhere after the first night." Frank released Carl's wrist and picked up the notebook, flipping through pages of phone numbers and addresses written in Maria's careful handwriting. Most of the entries looked ordinary: friends, relatives, businesses, but 3 addresses were marked with small stars, as if Maria had recognized them as significant. One of the starred addresses was the warehouse where Frank was standing. Another was Salvatore's restaurant. The third was a location in Oak Park that Frank didn't recognize, but which might be where Maria was being held. "The Oak Park address," Frank said, showing Carl the notebook. "What's there?" "I can't tell you that. They'll kill me if they find out I told you anything. They'll kill you if I don't find my wife alive." Carl looked at Frank with the expression of someone who just realized he'd walked into a trap without noticing the warning signs. "It's a safe house. Sometimes we need a place to keep people while situations get resolved. But Frank, if you go there, You're not going to be able to just walk in and take her. There are guards, security systems, people who shoot first and ask questions later. Frank pocketed the notebook and started toward the door, but Carl called after him. Frank, wait, you're not thinking straight. Even if you find her, even if you get her out, where are you going to go? These people have connections everywhere. They'll hunt you down and kill both of you. Maybe, Frank said, but at least we'll be together. Frank drove away from the warehouse with more information than he'd had since Maria's disappearance, but also with the understanding that he'd probably just signed both of their death warrants. Carl would report the conversation to his superiors, who would realize that Frank wasn't just a mechanic looking for work. They'd move Maria to a new location and eliminate the security breach that Frank represented. Frank had perhaps 6 hours before the Torino organization discovered that their new employee was actually the husband of their prisoner. 6 hours to find Maria, extract her safely, and disappear before Vincent and Angelo sent people to solve their Frank problem permanently. At 3 o'clock, Frank met with FBI Special Agent Lisa Martinez and her partner, Agent Robert Chen, in the back booth of a coffee shop in Rogers Park. James Brennan had arranged the meeting and provided the agents with background on Frank's situation, but they were obviously skeptical about his story and his methods. "You've committed several federal crimes in the past week," Agent Martinez said after Frank described his infiltration of the Torino organization. "Conspiracy, accessory after the fact to various felonies, probably obstruction of justice. We could arrest you right now." "But you're not going to," Frank said. "Because I have information about their operations that you've been trying to get for years." Agent Chen leaned forward. "What kind of information?" Frank described the warehouse, the modified vehicles, the cargo transportation network, and the safe house where Maria was probably being held. He gave them Carl's name and the addresses from Maria's notebook, everything he'd learned during his week-long investigation. "In exchange," Frank said, "I want federal protection for my wife and assistance in extracting her safely from wherever they're holding her." The agents exchanged glances that suggested they were having a conversation without words. Agent Martinez was the first to speak. "We can't authorize a federal operation based on information from someone who's been actively participating in criminal activities, but we might be able to provide backup support for a local police operation. The local police think Maria ran away from home. They might think differently if they had probable cause to search specific locations for a kidnapping victim." Frank understood what the agents were offering. They couldn't officially authorize him to rescue his wife, but they could make sure that police backup was available if he attempted it on his own. They couldn't provide federal resources for a domestic kidnapping case, but they might be able to ensure that the Torino organization was too busy dealing with other law enforcement problems to retaliate effectively. "How long do I have?" Frank asked. "Our surveillance indicates that the Torinos are planning to move some major operations this weekend," Agent Chen said. "If we're going to disrupt their network, tonight would be optimal timing. And if I wait until your operation is complete, your wife might not be there anymore." Frank left the coffee shop with an informal agreement that felt more like a suicide pact than a law enforcement operation. He would attempt to rescue Maria from the Oak Park safe house, while federal agents coordinated raids on other Torino facilities. With luck, the organization would be too scattered and confused to mount an effective response to Frank's activities. Without luck, Frank and Maria would be dead before morning. At 7 o'clock, Frank drove to Oak Park and located the address from Maria's notebook. It was a modest 2-story house in a middle-class neighborhood, the kind of place where suburban families raised their children and complained about property taxes. Nothing about it suggested that it was being used as a prison by organized crime figures. Frank parked 2 blocks away and approached the house on foot, using the darkness and the cover of mature trees to avoid being spotted by anyone who might be watching. Lights were on in the first-floor windows, and he could see shadows moving inside, but he couldn't determine how many people were in the house or where Maria might be located. The backyard was enclosed by a privacy fence that blocked the view from neighboring houses. Frank climbed over it carefully, landing on grass that had been recently mowed despite the December weather. Through a kitchen window, he could see 2 men sitting at a table, playing cards and drinking beer. Neither of them looked particularly alert, but Frank noticed a shotgun leaning against the wall near the back door. Frank moved along the side of the house, checking each window for signs of Maria. In what appeared to be a living room, he saw a third man watching television and eating dinner from a plate balanced on his lap. No sign of prisoners or anyone who looked like they didn't belong in a suburban house. The second floor was darker, with only one window showing light. Frank found a trellis that would support his weight and climbed carefully toward the illuminated window. Through curtains that had been drawn but not completely closed, he could see into a small bedroom where Maria sat on a narrow bed, reading a magazine. She was alive. She appeared to be unharmed. She was wearing different clothes than she'd had on when she disappeared, but she didn't look like someone who'd been tortured or abused. Frank felt relief wash over him like warm water, followed immediately by the understanding that the difficult part was just beginning. Frank tapped gently on the window glass. Maria looked up from her magazine, startled, then rushed to the window when she recognized his face. She pointed toward the door of the room and mouthed the word, "Locked," then held up 3 fingers to indicate how many guards were in the house. Frank gestured for her to move away from the window and used a small pry bar from his toolkit to force the window latch. The sound was minimal, but in the quiet suburban neighborhood it seemed as loud as a car alarm. Frank waited, listening for sounds that would indicate the guards had heard something suspicious. When no one came to investigate, Frank climbed through the window and into the bedroom where Maria was waiting for him. She threw her arms around him with the kind of desperate relief that confirmed everything he'd suspected about her situation. "How did you find me?" she whispered. "Your purse was in the warehouse where they keep the trucks. I've been working for them all week, learning how they operate." Frank quickly explained his plan for getting her out of the house and away from the neighborhood before the guards realized she was gone. It wasn't much of a plan. Climb out the window, get to the car, drive to a safe location, but it was the best he could manage under the circumstances. Maria told him what she'd learned during her week in captivity. She'd been kidnapped because she'd overheard a conversation between a truck driver and another man about a shipment that had been intercepted by federal agents. The driver had mentioned specific addresses and dates, information that could help law enforcement connect the Torino organization to smuggling operations throughout the Midwest. "They were going to kill me," Maria said, "but Vincent decided I might be useful as leverage if the FBI got too close to their operations." Frank helped Maria climb through the window and down the trellis, moving as quietly as possible while listening for sounds from inside the house. They were halfway to the back fence when a light came on in the kitchen, and Frank heard voices. "Check upstairs," someone said. "She was too quiet during dinner." Frank and Maria ran for the fence, no longer concerned about stealth. Behind them, the back door opened, and someone shouted for them to stop. Frank boosted Maria over the fence and was climbing after her when the shotgun fired, peppering the fence post next to his head with buckshot. They reached Frank's car as lights came on in houses throughout the neighborhood, and people began opening their doors to see what was happening. Frank started the engine and drove away at normal speed, resisting the urge to floor the accelerator and draw more attention to themselves. "Where do we go now?" Maria asked. "Somewhere safe while the FBI shuts down their operations." Frank drove toward the federal building downtown, where Agent Martinez had told him to bring Maria if he succeeded in rescuing her. Behind them, Oak Park was lighting up like a Christmas tree as police responded to reports of gunfire in a residential neighborhood. Frank's radio crackled with reports of simultaneous raids on the warehouse, the restaurant, and several other locations connected to the Torino organization. Federal agents were executing search warrants and making arrests throughout the city, coordinated with Frank's rescue operation to maximum effect. By morning, Vincent and Angelo Torino would be in federal custody, along with most of their associates. The transportation network Frank had discovered would be shut down, and the safe house where Maria had been held would be empty, except for crime scene investigators collecting evidence. Frank and Maria would be relocated to a safe location outside Chicago, while federal prosecutors prepared their case against the organization that had torn their lives apart. Eventually, they would testify at trials that would result in prison sentences measured in decades rather than years. It wasn't the ending Frank had planned when he'd started looking for his missing wife, but it was better than the ending he'd feared. Maria was alive and safe. The people who'd taken her were facing justice, and Frank had learned things about himself that he'd never known before. As they drove through the early morning darkness toward their appointment with federal agents, Maria reached over and took Frank's hand. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not giving up. For learning how to be someone you never wanted to be. For finding me when no one else could." Frank squeezed her hand and continued driving toward whatever came next. The investigation was over, but their story was just beginning.